Our last couple of gram-negative bacilli pathogens to talk about are non-enteric gram-negative bacilli. So the first one is called Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis causes plague. So the organism's name is genus Yersinia, species pestis, and the disease it causes is plague. So Yersinia, it spreads in a couple ways. Its number one way that it spreads is through the bite of a flea, but there are also some strains that can pass person to person, and these are the most dangerous strains. Yersinia's virulence factors is it does have a capsule, and it also has some envelope proteins that help allow the bacteria to hide from phagocytes, and they also can actually grow inside of phagocytes and invade the immune system. So the way that plague spreads is through fleas. Primarily, these fleas' main host are mice. So that's one of the reasons to be very, very careful about making sure your pets, your dogs and your cats get a regular flea treatment every month. Because if the flea hops onto a mouse and a mouse is inside of your home, then it could come in contact with one of your pets, or outside in the environment. Fleas, of course, will contaminate squirrels, chipmunks, and other wild rodents, and your dogs or cats could come in contact with the flea then. From there, the flea can actually jump onto a human and bite the human and introduce the Yersinia pestis, or if a human is coming into close contact with a wild animal like a chipmunk or a squirrel, then it's possible that the human could inhale the Yersinia pestis through aerosols. From there, it is possible, depending on the strain of Yersinia, for a human to pass it to another human. And that's when we would be most worried, is when it becomes human-to-human transmission and we can see this fast spread of the disease. So we have a few different classifications of plague. You might have heard about some of these like in history books, because plague has been one of those devastating epidemics that have killed thousands of people in history. So the first and most mild form of plague is bubonic plague. So bubonic plague is kind of like a localized plague where the flea bites an individual. The bacteria usually travels through the lymph to a lymph node. And what we see is a very, very swollen lymph node. And we have a special name for it. We call it a bubo. And that's where the name bubonic comes from. Bubo is a very swollen lymph node. If the bacteria enters the bloodstream, the bacteria can start replicating inside of macrophages in the bloodstream. And this can lead to a septicemic plague, which is a much more severe form of the disease. The main sign of a septicemic plague is the patient will get this very characteristic rash. Okay, there's like these dark purple rash, like spots that are clumped together. And this is called purpura. And you may have read in the history books, at one point there was something called the Black Plague. And this name came from this characteristic rash. Finally, the most severe form of plague is pneumonic plague. So pneumonic plague is when the bacteria becomes able to transmit person to person, and it can actually get into the lungs and then be expelled through coughing or sneezing, droplets in the air, and then another person can inhale it. And this is the most fatal form of the disease. It's actually fatal without treatment, and it's very highly contagious. Even today, we still see cases of all of these different plagues. But like I said, they're usually only associated with people who work in close contact with wild animals or wild rodents. But if you have a pet who gets infested with fleas, or your house gets infested with fleas, you're always at risk of one of these plagues. So it's very important to keep giving a flea treatment to your pets. Our final gram-negative bacillus are the Haemophilus. So just like this name sounds, heme indicates blood, and phile means to love. So these are organisms that love blood. In fact, these are some of the most fastidious microbes out there. The only way to grow a Haemophilus is using a chocolate agar. Remember, this is an agar for very fastidious, very picky microorganisms. What's good about Haemophilus is that they're actually very sensitive to things like temperature, antibiotics, disinfectants. So they're easily killed. By far the most dangerous Haemophilus is Haemophilus influenza. Now, this organism does not cause the flu. Remember, flu is a virus. This is actually a bacteria. But when it was first discovered, they thought it was the cause of the flu, so they gave it this really misleading name. But what Haemophilus influenza actually causes is bacterial meningitis. And it's one of the most severe forms of meningitis. Bacterial meningitis is much more dangerous than viral or fungal meningitis. And also it could cause a otitis media, which is an ear infection. That's another thing we see it cause, as well as pneumonia, bronchitis, things like that. Luckily, we do have a vaccine now, the Haemophilus influenza strain B vaccine. It's usually given to children in combination with DTaP. Because of this vaccine, you can see here where the vaccine was introduced, and now we have very few cases of Haemophilus influenza meningitis. A couple other Haemophilus to mention. Haemophilus ducreyi, this actually causes an STD. It's called chancroid. What this leads to is a very hard sore on the genitals, and the sore is actually called a chancre. So whenever someone sees a very hard sore, they know this is probably a Haemophilus ducreyi. It's actually sometimes part of someone's normal flora, but if introduced into the genital tract, can cause this STD.